to the OSET Women in Technology session on negotiating your salary and compensation package. The objective of this session is to give you information, strategies, and skills with which to negotiate fair and equitable compensation packages for yourself throughout your entire career in technology. We have a lot to say about the topic of negotiating a fair and equitable salary and compensation package. So much so that we're going to divide this video into two parts. So the first part of the video is going to talk about the reality. So we're going to start by taking a look at the results of the OSET 2014 salary survey. So what's the reality when it comes to salaries for women in technology? Then we're going to take a look at another piece of reality. What actually happens when women negotiate or don't negotiate their salary and compensation packages? So what's happening now with respect to negotiating compensation packages? Then we're going to take a look at the individual factors and the structural factors that affect the outcomes of women negotiating their salary and compensation. So that's the first part of the video. Then the second video, or the second part, is going to take a look at tips, strategies, and techniques to help you as you go in to negotiate your salary and compensation at different stages of your career. But right now, let's take a look at reality. What are the facts when it comes to women in technology, salaries, and compensation packages? In 2014, OSET contracted with Environics Research Group to gather salary information from its members. The resulting document, the Salary Survey 2014 Member Perspective, provides a lot of really interesting information about what's happening out in the market with respect to salaries for technologists, technicians, and associates. Take a look at this document. We've included it in your course materials if you're watching this video as part of a course, and really take some time to familiarize yourself with the results of this survey so that you have a very good understanding of what's happening in the market when it comes to salaries and women in technology. When the salaries for men and women put together were gathered as part of this survey, here were the numbers. Certified engineering technologists, the average salary on an annual basis was $89,498. For certified technicians, it was $84,224, and for associates, it was $62,757. So you can clearly see that certified engineering technicians and technologists earn the most money versus associates who are just entering the market earn the least money. So this should not be surprising. The salaries for men and women were put together and analyzed on a sector basis as well. So for the public sector, the average annual salary was $80,220. For the manufacturing sector, it was $82,485. And for the non-manufacturing sector, it was $87,026. Once again, these numbers are not too surprising. Where the data is surprising is when the salaries were analyzed by gender. So the mean salary with men and women together is $83,195. The mean salary for men only is $85,056, and the mean salary for women only is $67,173. This is a big difference. To quote directly from the report, although base salary makes up a greater portion of their total compensation, women responding to the 2014 survey reported lower base salaries and consequently lower total compensation than did men. $62,173 versus $85,056. While some of this disparity is driven by the fact that men in the sample tend to have longer professional tenures and more senior positions, significant differences in total compensation exist at every level. The 2014 salary survey shows a very clear difference between the pay and compensation packages of men and the pay and compensation packages of women. And this is true regardless of how many years of service and how much responsibility the individuals have. So the numbers or the facts are very clear. There is a pay differential between men and women in all of the sectors. The results of the OSET 2014 salary survey are not an isolated example of men receiving more pay and compensation than women. Unfortunately, this situation exists across quite a few different sectors. So it exists in the purely engineering sector, it exists in the IT sector, it exists in the finance sector, it exists in the business sector. Because of this pay differential has actually attracted quite a lot of interest from researchers. So that's where we're going to go next. We'll take a look at what the research says about these pay differences between the pay packages or the compensation packages that men receive and the compensation packages that women receive. The majority of the research that's been done on this pay differential between men's compensation packages and women's compensation packages has focused on the idea of negotiating. So researchers have looked at what happens when men versus women sit down with a hiring committee and negotiate their first salaries or their ongoing salaries or salaries that transition them further in their career. So that's been one of the main focuses. What happens when men and women negotiate? The first category of research within this overall look at what happens when men and women are negotiating for their salaries and compensation packages asks and tries to answer the question, do women actually negotiate? So researchers have put men and women in different scenarios and tried to figure out, in these scenarios, do men negotiate and women don't negotiate? Or do both men and women negotiate? Or do men not negotiate and women negotiate? So they're looking at these scenarios to try and figure out and answer the question, do women actually negotiate their salary and compensation packages? And this research has been quite interesting. So when we just take a general look at negotiating, the answer is men tend to negotiate more than women. So men will go into a situation and they'll try and negotiate a better package for themselves or a better outcome for themselves, and women won't. And there's two ideas or two kind of hypotheses about why this is. Why do women not negotiate? The first one is that women have simply been socialized in North American cultures to be less assertive and to not put their needs forward, to not make their needs known, to not state what they actually want. So there's this idea that women have been socialized not to be assertive and therefore not to negotiate. Another hypothesis about why women don't negotiate is that women tend to put their faith in the system. They tend to go into a discussion about a new job that, the employer will give me what I'm worth, and I trust the employer to reward me appropriately and reward me according to what the market says I'm worth. So women simply trust more. They trust that they're going to get what they're worth and they're going to get what they deserve. The question of whether women actually negotiate their salary and compensation packages or not gets clouded a little bit with another set of research that dug into a little bit more of the specifics about what happens when men and women negotiate. And what researchers started to do is they started to play around with the parameters of the negotiating. So one set of research actually had men and women go and interview for a hypothetical job, and the job advertisement said that the salary was negotiable. And when the job advertisement said the salary was negotiable, the women negotiated. However, when the researchers switched it around and did not indicate that the salary was negotiable, the women didn't negotiate and the men did. So part of the picture starts to be that women almost need permission or need to be given permission to negotiate. And if they're given that permission to negotiate, they go for it. Here's the second thing that researchers found when they were exploring this issue of women negotiating or not negotiating. They found that women would negotiate on behalf of someone else, but they would not negotiate on behalf of themselves. And we'll explore this a little bit later in the session. So we'll look at women feel much more comfortable advocating for someone else than advocating for themselves. They will negotiate to help someone else out, but they won't negotiate to help themselves out. The next set of research around negotiating asked and answered the question, when women do actually negotiate, do they negotiate as well as men? So are women as good at negotiating as men? That was the research question. Once again, when they looked at it quite generally, they found that men were better negotiators than women. They tended to be much more assertive, sometimes bordering on the aggressive, but they tended to get better outcomes for themselves than the women who did actually negotiate. But researchers played around with this a little bit more and found something else that was interesting. When they primed the women for power, so they had an activity before the negotiations that made the women feel empowered, so somehow the women were made to feel powerful, then they were actually just as effective at negotiating as the men were. So researchers uncovered that there was this power piece going on, that when women felt powerful, they were just as good at negotiating as the men. The third research question that researchers asked and tried to answer was the question of whether negotiating makes any difference anyway. So they looked at situations in which women negotiated and negotiated well, and then they looked at the outcomes and compared those to the outcomes that the men got. And what they found was a little bit depressing, I'll confess, but this is reality, so let's face reality. They found that regardless of how good the women were at negotiating, they still didn't end up where the men ended up. So this led researchers to start looking at what are the contextual factors or the systemic factors that contribute to the lower pay that women end up with. So they looked at all of the environmental factors, organizational factors, and so on to start to pull out what else is affecting the end result of women's pay and compensation other than their negotiating or not, and other than their ability to negotiate. When we pull all of this research together, we can put it into a really clear and simple diagram that helps us to understand what happens when it comes to women versus men negotiating their pay and compensation packages. So we've got two sets of factors that we need to look at and understand. We've got the individual factors. So these are factors that an individual has some degree of control over. And then we've got the structural or contextual factors. So these are things happening in the context or the environment that we actually don't have quite as much control over. But we do need to know they're there because we're going to come up against them all the time throughout our careers. So when we're looking at this overall problem or issue of negotiating fair and equitable compensation and salaries, we need to look at the individual factors and then the structural factors. Before we take a look in more detail at these individual factors and the structural factors that impact the outcomes of negotiating, I want to put one more thing out there. You might be listening to this and you might be thinking to yourself, well, you know what? I like my salary. I'm quite happy with it. I think it's fair. I really don't care what other people make. I enjoy my job. I have other things that make me happy in my job, and it's not all about money. That may be true. However, you need to take a big picture look at this issue. If you look at someone's entire career, and if you look at that pay difference and add up the pay difference from every year over, say, a 20, 30, or 40-year career, you're looking at between $500,000 and $1.5 million in compensation that get left on the table when women accept that they are paid less than men. That's a lot of money. That's money that could go towards your own personal financial security. You could use it to pay down your mortgage. You could use it to put into retirement savings plans. You could use it for your kids' education. This money would provide you with a lot of financial security, so you should not ignore this issue. It's important. We'll start by taking a look at the individual factors that researchers have found impact the outcomes of the negotiating process. So we'll take a look at each of these factors, and keep in mind with the individual factors, these are factors that you as a person have much more control over. When we get to the structural factors, you don't have a lot of control over those. But the individual factors you have some control over. So these are things that you should think about, how can I put these into place in my life because I have some control over this. The first category of individual factors is personality traits. So who you are as a person. Within personality traits, the first group of characteristics or traits that we'll look at all have to do with assertiveness. So there's 4 terms here that we need to take a look at. The first one is passive, the second one is aggressive, the third is passive aggressive, and the fourth is the one we want to go for, assertive. So passive is a person who kind of sits back and lets life pass him or her by. So this is someone who doesn't put an opinion out there, doesn't take a stand on anything, and that this is a person who certainly doesn't come out and say, look, here's what I want and here's what I need. Obviously, a person who's passive does not negotiate well. The second trait that's opposite to passive is aggressive. So a person who's aggressive is someone who very strongly goes after what she wants. So this is a person who knows what she wants. She'll do whatever it takes in order to get it. So this person's very competitive, expresses opinion all the time, has no problem with conflict or confrontation. Surprisingly, aggressive people, particularly aggressive women, are not good at negotiating. Because as we'll see later on when we look at types of negotiating, a competitive type negotiation actually can very often backfire, and it can particularly backfire on women. So being overly aggressive is not a good personality trait for successful negotiating. The third trait in this group is passive aggressive, and this is kind of a sneaky one. So a person who is passive aggressive knows what he or she wants, but doesn't actually say it. So this person doesn't express opinion, doesn't say, here's what I want or here's what I need. This person instead works behind the scenes, kind of in a sneaky way and a manipulative way in order to achieve his or her goal. So passive aggressive people are not good negotiators either, because they don't put forward in the negotiating process what they want, but they try to work behind the scenes to make it successful, and it often backfires. So being passive aggressive is not a good trait for successful negotiating. The personality trait that will make you successful when it comes to negotiating is being assertive or assertiveness. Assertiveness is when you know what you want and you're very confident about what you want, and you simply put it out there, and you put it out there respectfully. And as you put it out there, you respect that other people may have different opinions, other people have their own rights as well, but you also have your rights, and you have your opinion, and you have the right to express that opinion, and you have the right to go after what you want and after what you need. So being assertive is the best personality trait to adapt here, and that means you're going after what you want, but you're not doing it competitively. You're simply doing it from a position of, I'm confident, I know what I want, and I know I have the right to go after what I want. When researchers identified assertiveness as a positive personality trait for women to have when they go into negotiations, a lot of assertiveness training was developed and implemented to help women negotiate. And it certainly had an impact. It only got women so far because then they came up against these structural factors that we'll look at. But assertiveness training really is a good first step. So if this is you, if you're either passive or passive aggressive and you need to get to the point of being assertive, then you need to take a look at assertiveness training. It's time well spent because it allows you to learn how to confidently say, here's what I want and here's what I need. The next personality trait that researchers have identified as being important when it comes to negotiating is self-confidence and self-esteem. The research shows that when women are more self-confident and have more self-esteem, first of all, they put more effort into the negotiating process because they believe they'll have a successful outcome. And second of all, they don't settle. So women who are not self-confident don't put a lot of effort into the negotiating process, and they also tend to more quickly accept whatever's offered, even if it's not what they're looking for. So being self-confident and having self-esteem helps you be a better negotiator. So if you're a type of person, or if you're a person who doesn't have a lot of self-confidence, or you don't have that self-esteem, there is training out there, once again, that you can take to target this. So there are tricks and strategies and skills that you can put into play in order to have more self-confidence and more self-esteem when it comes to negotiating. So if this is you, that's the type of training you want to take a look at. The next trait that researchers identified as being important is the perception of power and perception of influence. Women who perceive themselves as having power and who perceived themselves as having influence in a situation were much more successful at the negotiating process. And the opposite was true. Women who perceive themselves as being powerless and without influence in a situation, they simply were not as successful at negotiating. So in order to feel more powerful and more influential going into a negotiating situation, what do? How do you get yourself to that position? There are a few tricks or strategies. One of them is to, first of all, know your value in the market. So know what the salary surveys are saying. So if you go into a negotiating situation and you know what you're worth, that gives you power. Okay? Also, if you have another job offer, so if you've got 2 job offers that you're deciding between, that gives you power in the situation as well. The other thing that gives you power is having influence. So if there are people that you have in your corner who can speak on your behalf when you're negotiating for a salary or when you're negotiating for a job, use them, okay? Get people in your corner who have influence, and that in turn gives you influence when you're going in to negotiate. The final personality trait that researchers identified as impacting negotiating is the personality trait of your attitude towards conflict. So they found that women who did not like conflict and tried to avoid conflict were quite obviously not as good at negotiating as women who were not afraid of conflict. They dug into this a little bit more, however. What they found was really interesting. The reason so many of the women in their studies were afraid of conflict was that these women placed more importance on relationships than they did on money. So when they were negotiating for salaries, the women were much more cognizant of not damaging their relationships with their bosses, managers, and so on, than they were of going after the dollar amount that they wanted for their compensation package. So there's a reason that the women in these studies were actually afraid of conflict or avoided conflict. They felt that the relationships were much more important than getting the dollar amount that they were asking for. So if this is you, what do you do? Well, what you have to realize is that it's possible to maintain the relationship and still go after the dollar amount that you're looking for. You maintain the relationship by negotiating assertively, respectfully, and courteously. And you maintain the relationship by understanding where the other person is coming from, understanding whether there is actually money available for a raise or not, or for that salary or not. So understanding where the other person's coming from, being respectful, being courteous, these are all things that help you maintain the relationship as you're negotiating and still go after what you want. So if you keep that in mind, then you'll realize that you don't have to be afraid of conflict in the negotiating process, because there are ways of mitigating any conflict that might arise. So keep that in mind if you're one of these people who are afraid of conflict and don't want to damage the relationship. These are the personality traits that researchers have identified as directly impacting the negotiating outcomes for women. If one of these personality traits applies to you, please make sure that you take training if it's available. For example, if it's assertiveness is the personality trait that you need to go after, make sure you get the training, do additional research, get people to help you out on these personality traits so that you can go into your negotiations more confidently and be more successful with your outcomes. The next individual factor identified by researchers is the factor called personal values. So personal values are all about what we as individuals feel are important. So we place importance on this versus this and so on. So those are our personal values. Let's take a look at 3 personal values that do significantly impact the negotiating process. The first one we've already sort of talked about when we talked about the attitude towards conflict, and this is relationship oriented. So if you're the type of person who places a lot of value on your relationships to the extent that it impacts other things that you're going after, this is a personal value that is going to affect your ability to negotiate for yourself in terms of salary and compensation. As I already mentioned, relationship orientation means that you are going to value the relationship with your boss or your potential employer more than you value getting the dollar amount that you're looking for in your pay and compensation. I've already talked about this. I'll just do a quick reminder. If this is you, remember it is possible to maintain relationships and still get the dollar value you're going after with your salary and your compensation. You just have to do your negotiating respectfully and confidently, and you actually won't end up damaging your relationships. The next personal value that researchers identified is the need to be liked. So many women place importance on being liked. That's what they value. And they place so much importance on that that they actually don't go after what they want if they think it will mean they won't be liked. This is a really crucial negotiating factor for women, because when we get to the structural factors, you'll see that unfortunately women are very often judged on likability versus competence when it comes to the workplace. And so there's a reason that we as women often put a lot of importance on likability versus going after what we want. We know that there's a harsh price to pay within the structural factors if we're not perceived as being likable. So likability is kind of one of these catch-22 personal values for women. However, when it comes to negotiating, if you're worried about your likability, or if you're worried about being liked, unfortunately, it will negatively impact your negotiating. Women who are not worried about being liked and who are quite confident putting it on the table, here's what I want, I don't care whether you like me or not, they're actually more successful at getting what they want. But it is a catch-22, as we'll see when we get to the structural factors. And the final personal value identified by researchers as being important to negotiating is your achievement motivation. How much do you value achievement? So how much do you value advancing in your career, going after that higher salary, going after that position with more responsibility, and so on? And this one's a pretty obvious connection. The more you have achievement motivation, the better you're going to be at negotiating, because this is high stakes for you. Negotiating is you going after what you want, you value achievement, and you're going to put everything into the negotiating in order to make sure that you get what you want to achieve. Looking at personal values as a way to improve your negotiating is not quite as straightforward as looking at your personality traits. It's a little bit harder to give up values that are very core and central to who you are in order to go after a higher salary package, for example. However, just being aware of what your values are and the impact that these values have on the negotiating process is a really good first step. And then you need to look for a way to maintain those values, so keep those values, but also be successful negotiating. So we've talked about this already with relationships. How do you maintain your value on relationships but still negotiate successfully? And how do you achieve likability but still negotiate successfully? So this one, the personal values is not quite as clear-cut as the personality traits in terms of what you can control and what you can change in order to be more successful negotiating. The biggest step here really is just being aware of what your personal values are and then how those might impact your negotiating. The next individual factor that researchers identified as being important when it comes to negotiating outcomes is negotiating style. So there are 3 styles that we're going to take a look at and just briefly discuss. And we'll look at each style and how that style impacts or can impact the negotiating process. The first negotiating style we've actually already briefly mentioned, and this is the style of self-advocacy versus other advocacy. I already mentioned that women are much better at negotiating on behalf of someone else rather than negotiating on behalf of themselves. So this is called other advocacy. So when women are negotiating on behalf of their kids or their spouse or a friend or their employees, they're actually much more effective than when they're negotiating on behalf of themselves. So other advocacy is a negotiating style that women are much better at. Self-advocacy, unfortunately, is a style that women are not so good at. So advocating for ourselves is something that can be very challenging for many women. So the very first thing you have to be conscious of when it comes to negotiating style is, do you have a comfort zone around self-advocacy or other advocacy? And if it's other advocacy, you need to take all of the skills and all of the strategies that you use negotiating on behalf of someone else, and then you need to put those to work for yourself. The skills are the same. You just need to be more comfortable using that skill set on behalf of yourself rather than on behalf of someone else. The next negotiating style that researchers looked at was a contrast between cooperative negotiating and competitive negotiating. Cooperative negotiating, as the name implies, means that everyone works together to try and achieve an outcome that is the best possible outcome for everyone involved. Competitive, so it's a win-win. Competitive negotiating, as the name implies, is a win-lose type of outcome. So women are much better at cooperative negotiating than they are at competitive negotiating. What does this mean for you when you're negotiating your salary and compensation package? You're probably pretty comfortable with cooperative negotiating. So when you go in to negotiate your salary, don't think of it as a competition. Don't think of it in a win-lose situation. Position your negotiating as a win-win for yourself and your company. So before you go in to negotiate, think about, why is this positive for you and why is this positive for your company? And then you're going in there with a cooperative negotiating approach or style, and you're going to feel much more confident, and you'll be much stronger, and you'll probably get that win-win for everyone. The third negotiating style that researchers have looked at is a contrast between interest-based negotiating and positional negotiating. I'm not going to tell you about this one yet, however. I just want you to realize that this is a third set of negotiating styles researchers looked at. We're going to take a much deeper look at interest-based versus positional later in the session. These are the negotiating styles that researchers have identified are important to this discussion about women negotiating pay and compensation packages. What are your takeaways here? Well, if you are more comfortable with other advocacy, what you have to do is take that skill set that you use to advocate on behalf of other people, and you have to apply it to your self-advocacy. So it's the same skill set, you just need to be comfortable using it for yourself as you use it for others. The next thing you need to think about, your next takeaway, is remember you're probably more comfortable with cooperative negotiating, and salary and compensation negotiating can be a cooperative negotiating process. So plan it out in your mind as a win-win, and that's how you go in, and that's how you get the salary that you're looking for. And the next one I didn't tell you about, but we're going to work towards an interest-based negotiating style as opposed to a positional-based negotiating style, but more on that later. The final individual factor that researchers have looked at in quite a bit of detail is negotiating skill. In fact, that's the factor they first honed in on when they were looking at this pay differential between what men get paid and women get paid. And not surprisingly, they found that negotiating skill is a factor in getting the outcomes that you're looking for. So the more skilled you are, whether you're a man or a woman, the better your outcomes are going to be. They also found that men were just generally more skilled at negotiating. And here's why. Men tend to have, and this is a massive generalization, so you have to excuse it, but research does back this up. Men generally tend to see many more of their daily interactions as negotiating processes, whereas women see very few things as a negotiating process. And how researchers figured this out was by asking a group of men and a group of women about when they last negotiated. And so the men, when they were asked this question, they were like, yesterday I was negotiating what we would have for dinner with my wife, or I was negotiating whether I was going to take the garbage out or not, or I was negotiating trying to get one of my employees to do something for me. So men see many more of their daily transactions as negotiating transactions. The men in the research group also indicated when they would have future negotiating, and they said, you know what, probably tomorrow. The women in this research group, however, had a very different story. They had to go much further back in time, sometimes 2, 3, or 4 months, in order to identify a transaction that they regarded as being a negotiating transaction. And the same thing in the future, the women did not anticipate that they would be negotiating anything in the future. So there's a very different perspective. Once again, this is a generalization in terms of men and women about when they should be negotiating. Men tend to see almost every daily transaction as a negotiating transaction. Women, on the other hand, see very specific things as being a negotiating transaction. Therefore, when it comes to negotiating skill, men are actually more skilled because they get more practice, because they negotiate everything. Whereas women, because they see negotiating as being part of such a very small thing and not an infrequent transaction that they do, they're simply not as skilled and not as comfortable with it. So because of this difference in terms of how men versus women view daily transactions as being negotiating transactions or not negotiating transactions, men are just generally more skilled in negotiating because they negotiate everything. As I mentioned, negotiating skill is kind of where researchers first looked when they were looking at this pay differential issue between men and women. And because they identified this difference in skill level, negotiating skill workshops or training was one of the first pieces that was put into place in order to help women negotiate better salaries and better compensation packages for themselves. It didn't always work, but it was a really good starting point. So if you personally just don't feel that you have good negotiating skills, this is a really good place to start. Enroll in any type of negotiating training or negotiating workshop that you can find, and then practice, 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 practice. Take a look at some of these daily transactions that you might not think are negotiating transactions, but really are, and then just try your negotiating skills in these small, low stakes or small stakes transactions, and then you'll be more comfortable when it comes to the high stakes negotiating transactions. So 2 things to do here. If you don't feel you have good negotiating skills, get some training. And also just practice. Practice on your daily transactions, make them negotiating transactions so that you feel more comfortable with your negotiating skills. These are the individual factors that researchers have identified have impacted this salary and compensation difference that we see between what women get paid and what men get paid. So these are the individual factors: personality traits, personal values, negotiating styles, and negotiating skills. However, here's what the research also showed. The research also showed that even very successful women, so women with the personality traits that make them good negotiators, the values that make them good negotiators, the skills and the styles, even those successful women still have a significant pay difference when compared to what the men in similar positions make. And interestingly, that pay difference just increases. The higher up these women went in an organization, the greater that pay difference became. So this is when researchers realized, you know what? It's not all about these individual factors. There are other factors at work that are creating these pay differences between what women get and what men get. So let's take a look at those next. Negotiating does not take place in a vacuum. It takes place in a specific context or a specific environment. And within that context or environment, there are what we call structural factors that affect the outcomes of the negotiating. That's what we're going to take a look at. We're going to start this section by taking a look at 2 quotes that tell you just how much impact these structural factors can have on the negotiating process. These 2 quotes both come from the same researcher, Wade, who did this research in 2001. So here's quote number 1. Pay and promotion disparities afflict even successful women who are armed with advanced education, business experience, and confidence. In fact, some researchers have noted that the salary gap increases with experience. The income of successful women falls further behind successful men as their careers advance. And here's a second quote from the same researcher, Wade, in 2001. Negotiation is a critical element in finalizing job offers and accepting promotions, and thus in determining pay. But negotiation does not occur in a vacuum. Negotiation takes place in a complex environment constrained by many social, psychological variables. As individuals, we don't have a lot of control over the structural factors that affect our negotiating outcomes. So why do we need to know about them? We need to know about them, first of all, just for awareness purposes. There's nothing worse than being affected by things we can't see. I call these things the invisible walls. So you just hit this invisible wall or this barrier and you're like, well, what is that? I have no idea what just hit me. Well, these structural factors are those invisible walls. So by learning about them, they become visible. Not invisible, they become visible. You know what it is that you're up against. When you know what it is you're up against, then you can start to make choices. You can either find ways around these barriers or these walls that you're coming up against. You can try and find a way over it. You can try and put other strategies into place. But it's really important to know these structural factors because, first of all, you can't control them, but you can put strategies into place to deal with them. The first structural factor is gender-linked stereotypes and social roles. These are also called gender norms. Every society or every culture has specific ways that they feel men and women should be and should behave. So these are called gender norms. In North America, still, the gender norms for men are that they are task-oriented, action-oriented, and assertive. The gender norms for women, still, are that they are relationship-oriented, supporting of others, and caring. How do gender norms relate to salary negotiations? It comes down to likability. When women step outside of the gender norms, so for example, when they act assertively as opposed to in a supporting or caring way, then they pay a price in terms of likability. And for women with these gender roles, they get influence by being more likable, not by being more assertive. So if you step outside of gender norms as a woman, you become less likable and therefore you have less influence or less power. So with women with this set of gender norms, likability gives you influence, non-likability decreases your influence or decreases your power. So this is the catch-22 that I was talking about when I talked about personality traits. So it's all well and good to learn to be assertive. However, you need to realize that by being assertive, you're actually stepping outside of the gender norm for women, because assertive is a gender norm for men. It is not a gender norm for women. So what happens when you step outside of that, when you are assertive, then you become less likable, and then you pay a price in terms of the influence that you have. So it is a catch-22. Each person has to make her own decision about how she's going to deal with this, but you do need to know that. The gender norms still say women should not be assertive, women should be supportive and caring. To highlight this catch-22 when it comes to gender norms and negotiating, I'll give you another quote from Wade. Wade has some really good quotes, as you can tell. And so this highlights the dilemma that we as women face when it comes to being assertive and therefore stepping outside of those gender norms. It is not that women do not have the necessary skills or self-esteem to negotiate. Rather, it is argued that women have learned their social normative lessons all too well. I'll share my personal experience when it comes to this particular structural factor, the structural factor of gender-linked stereotypes and social norms. Throughout my 25-year career, I've learned the hard way, as Wade has said so articulately in her quotes, that when I am assertive, I pay a price in terms of likability. And when my likability goes down, my influence goes down. So whenever, and I do mean whenever, I'm in a situation of negotiating, and when I think I have to be assertive, I always question, okay, am I going to be assertive? And then I know, okay, I'm going to pay a likability price here, and can I afford to pay that likability price in this particular situation? So every situation in which I have to be assertive, I question it, and I make sure that yes, assertiveness is the right approach, and I do that knowing that I am going to pay a likability price, so to speak, and that's going to affect my influence in the situation as well. So it's a horrible catch-22 to be in, and it's a very real catch-22 situation. The next set of structural factors that influence women's abilities to get fair and equitable pay and compensation packages are networking, mentorship, and sponsorship. We've grouped all of these together because they all have one underlying commonality, and that is these three actions, networking, mentorship, and sponsorship, all give us access to people who have resources, knowledge, power, and experience. And without access to people like this, our careers really don't go anywhere. Our careers tend to plateau. So networking, mentorship, and sponsorship all give us access to people who have power, resources, and influence, and we can use that access to help us with our careers. Now that we know how network, mentorship, and sponsorship are the same, I'm going to differentiate them. So networking is all about building relationships, not super deep relationships, but not really superficial relationships either, but it's all about building relationships with people who have common interests. So you might have a network of colleagues and former colleagues. Your current manager would be in that network, past managers would be in that network, friends and family members can be in that network. Just people that you've built relationships up with over the years who know you, who know your capabilities, but also who you help and they help. So it's kind of a mutual give and take in a networking relationship. So the bigger your network, the more able you are to tap into people who can help you build a successful career. So there are a lot of training programs and lectures and things out there on networking. So if this is an area that you need to build up, by all means, you should go out there and seek help in building yourself a really solid and extensive network. The next way that we can access people who have resources, power, and influence is through a mentoring or a mentorship relationship. Mentoring is usually one-on-one. So networking is building up a group of lots of people. Mentoring or mentorship is all about a one-on-one relationship with an individual who usually is more experienced than you and also more connected, who can give you advice and guidance at different points in your career. So a mentorship is kind of a helping relationship, and although it's two-way in terms of its rewards, it is very much one-way in terms of the advice and the experience and so on is going from the mentor to the mentoree or the person being mentored. And once again, there are lots of programs out there to help women find mentors and build that mentoring relationship. So if that's a piece that's missing from your current situation, take a look at those resources and go after getting yourself a mentor who can guide you and help you and give you advice as you go along your career. When researchers started looking at this pay differential between men and women, one of the things that they did zone in on or hone in on is the lack of networks that women had and the lack of mentors that women had. So a lot of programs have been put into place to address these gaps that women appear to have in the support system around them to help them get those pay and compensation packages. So networking and mentoring have really been looked at by researchers in terms of can these two systems help women with their pay and compensation package negotiations. The third piece to this puzzle, however, seems to be the most important one, and this is sponsorship. Sponsorship goes above and beyond mentoring or mentorship. Sponsorship means that you have an individual in your life who actually puts you forward for positions and promotions. So they're kind of behind you pushing or above you pulling up, whichever analogy you want to use. So this is a person who has a lot of influence and who directly uses that influence to pull you up the career ladder or push you up the career ladder. It's quite different from mentorship. Mentorship is all about advice. Someone's using their experience to, give you ideas and so on. But sponsorship is all about directly pulling you into positions, opening up positions for you, making really key and influential introductions that open up positions for you. So sponsorship, is the third piece in this puzzle of getting women access to people who have resources, power, and influence. And interestingly, the research shows that sponsorship is the key piece in this puzzle. Networking and mentoring help, but sponsorship is really the piece that has a huge impact in terms of the careers that women build for themselves. So if you're lacking a sponsor, this is something that you really want to put into place in your current situation. There are two terms that we often hear kicked around when we're discussing this idea of women not having access to people who have resources, power, and influence. And these are the terms the Old Boys Club or the Old Boys Network and the glass ceiling. These phenomena are both very real. So the Old Boys Network is basically a combination of men having access to a pre-existing network so they don't have to go out and build it, and they also have access to built-in mentors and built-in sponsorship. So the Old Boys Club or the Old Boys Network is all about this very solid network that combines networking, mentoring, and sponsorship that helps men along in their careers. Women getting access to this Old Boys Network is very, very challenging because it's very much an us and them type phenomenon. The Old Boys Network takes place on the golf course. All the stereotypes come into play here. Probably some men listening to this video might take offense, but this is real. A lot of the networking, mentoring, and sponsoring gets done in certain scenarios, and many of those scenarios are men only, and this is still true today. Some women are breaking into the Old Boys Network or the Old Boys Club, but it's still a very real phenomenon. The glass ceiling is also a very real phenomenon. We have many high-profile women who have broken through the glass ceiling, and so the glass ceiling is kind of this invisible wall or invisible barrier to women advancing further up the ladder within a company. So they can go this far and then boing, they just hit this invisible wall and they can't go any further. There are quite a number of high-profile women who've managed to break that glass ceiling and move to the very tops of their organizations. But when you look at the percentages are very small still of women who are in those top positions versus men who are in those top positions. And those percentages are particularly discouraging when you look at the overall percentage of women in the workforce. versus men, and then the percentage of women in those high positions. So the glass ceiling is also very real, and the glass ceiling exists once again because of those three structural pieces we've just defined: the networking piece, the mentoring piece, and the sponsorship piece. So if you're in a position where you are coming up against a glass ceiling, this is where you need to look. You need to look at who's in your network, how can you use that network more effectively, do you have a mentor, how can that mentor help you, and most importantly, do you have a sponsor within your organization who can help push you through that glass ceiling. These structural factors are real. You can't delude yourself that these are not in place. So the gender roles and stereotyping, they're in place, they exist. And the importance of networking and mentoring and sponsorship and women's challenges accessing those, that's all real. So we do have to be aware that, yes, there are individual factors that we can control, but also there are these structural factors, and they're real. We have to deal with them. So we can't change the reality that these gender stereotypes exist, and we can't change the reality of the need for networking, mentoring, and sponsorship, but we can put into place strategies, which I've already mentioned, about how to deal with those realities and try and turn those realities around to benefit us. In this part of the session, we started out by looking at what the actual reality is. So we've looked at the salary situation for women in technology based on the OSET 2014 salary survey. We've also taken a look at what actually happens when women go into situations where they have to negotiate, or they should negotiate, their salary and compensation packages. Then we've looked at two sets of factors that influence the outcomes of that negotiating and those attempts to increase those packages. The first set of factors are individual factors, and these are the ones that we have control over. And then the second set of factors are the structural factors. These are factors that exist within the system or the context that we have to be aware of, and then we have to figure out how to work around or manage in some other way. We're going to move on now to take a look at different strategies, tips, and techniques to use to increase the effectiveness of your negotiating. So that'll be the next part of this session.